Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
This is part 7 of What If Ichigo Lost His Zanpakuto in the World of One Piece? Credit goes to unseeded 4th. Chapter 20. Change. Ichigo Flash stepped into the air to avoid the large wave that struck the coast. It had obviously been triggered by the explosion and earthquake that had just occurred, seemingly from out of nowhere. "What the hell?" he muttered, as the mini tsunami rushed inland, swamping some of the coastal buildings. Whatever had caused the blast must have been planted, given the proximity of the explosion. Ichigo wondered how and why it had been detonated. Weren't the Marines on their way? He shrugged and focused on the Marine ships as they continued approaching, unbothered by the explosion. If anything, they were advancing on the island at an even faster rate than before. Ichigo turned his attention towards one of the mountainous shapes out on the ocean with a concerned frown, as a distinct rumbling sounded from its general direction. After a moment, he returned his focus to the approaching ships. It would be best to take things as they came at the moment, and right now, the Marines were looming all the closer. From where he stood in the sky, Ichigo noticed other Marine ships docking into other locations on the island's northwest coast. Aside from the pod arriving where he'd been waiting, there were 2 other pods sailing in elsewhere on the coast. Each contained 3 ships, 9 all up. How many officers would that make, he wondered. And how strong would they be? I'll find out soon, I guess, he thought to himself. The fleet of ships were not hindered by the recent flooding. The vessels sailed up to the beach before they opened up and ramps dropped down. Armed officers spilled out and Ichigo prepared himself to fight. A symphony of sirens blared through the city's expanse, alerting its residents that disaster would be striking a week prematurely. Smoker and his gathered G5 officers listened as the new siren sounded over the Tenryubito's distress signal, which by now was dying down due to the arrival of the other Marines. "That can't be," Tashigi muttered, having joined with Smoker mere moments before. "The volcano isn't due for another week." Quote, "Looks like it's coming now, in an hour at most," Smoker remarked. "That can't be good." Merlin panicked. No one started evacuating yet. Smoker scrutinized the Marine ships that had docked at the island and the various officers that were piling forth. "That's not a problem. Some of these men are probably here to assist in that. What we need to do is find Straw Hat before they do." Vice Admiral Smoker. A flamboyant voice shouted from nearby. The group turned to see a Marine officer from part of the recently arrived fleet coming their way. "Commodore Agiti," Smoker muttered distastefully. "So you and your division are here in Atlantica, Vice Admiral Smoker," the Agiti observed. "I was wondering when I'd see you again. Still chasing after that Straw Hat, I presume?" He briefly glanced at their surroundings, "though I will again assume you haven't caught him. At any rate, my men and I will have him in our clutches before this night is over. Isn't that right, boys?" Quote. The surrounding Marines cheered their response, along with phrases such as, "Down with Straw Hat," as well as various wishes to win the favor of the Tenryubito, which Smoker knew was probably futile no matter what happened. "Aren't any of you here to assist the evacuations?" Smoker asked. "Our orders are simple," the Commodore Agiti reported, "capture the Straw Hats and leave it at that." "So you're just going to ignore the civilians?" Exclamation mark. Toshigi demanded, enraged, when that volcano blows, it will be a problem for you as well. Quote. We plan to be out of here before the volcano reaches its worst, the Commodore retorted. This island seems to be capable of taking care of itself in a variety of ways. I'm sure they can prepare to evacuate in a limited time. If not, it's not our problem. The Tenryubito have ordered us to capture the Straw Hats and their associates, and to place anything above those orders would be opposing the world government. And you don't want to do that, do you, Vice Admiral Smoker? Quote. Smoker glared at the man and then raised an eyebrow. It's not like I haven't done that before. What about the people's lives? A voice suddenly spoke up and interrogated the man. Smoker glanced over to see it was Merlin. They all thought the volcano wouldn't erupt for another week. Someone rigged that explosion just before, and now the volcano will be coming real soon. There was nothing they could do to anticipate it. Quote. The Commodore took a moment to look Merlin up and down. A warrant officer, hey? I am a Commodore. I outrank you. Know your place and remain silent, or you'll be stripped of your title. Merlin's right though. Charlie butted in before Smoker could stop him. The people haven't prepared for the evacuation. If we don't help them, lots of people won't make it out in time. Smoker sighed. Trust those two to speak up at such a time like this. Agiti looked on at them with a disapproving glare. You need to watch your subordinates, Vice Admiral Smoker. Don't want them to go damaging your image now, do we? Quote. Don't give me advice, Smoker snapped. In fact, I think I might teach them a lesson on proper marine conduct since it's clear you're incapable of doing so. And what could you do about it? Smoker questioned. Specific privilege from the higher-ups, the Commodore reported. I have the power to recruit any officer of lower rank than I from other divisions to join this expedition, regardless of what their main superior, that means you, has to say about it. Therefore, those two dimwit warrant officers of yours will come with me to learn a thing or two about how we do things here in the Marines. Huh? We don't want to join you. Merlin protested. You don't get a say, Agiti said, unless you wish to be demoted, of course. Merlin and Charlie appeared at a loss of how to respond. Go with him, you two, Smoker prompted. But Smoker-san. Do as I say. You want to keep your positions, don't you? Quote. Merlin opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. Come on then, you two, Agiti beckoned, no farewells, we have pirates to catch. As the two were led away with Agiti and the rest of his division, Toshigi frowned. Those two were starting to warm up on me. Other officers made similar remarks, but Smoker chose to ignore them. What those two choose to do is up to them now. They're smarter than they act, so maybe things will work out for them. Anyway, we have other matters to tend to. What should we do, Smoker-san? Another officer asked. Smoker glared at the mass of Marines swarming the island in search of the Straw Hats and their associates. We do what we're meant to do as Marines, he answered eventually. One of the most important parts of our code is to protect civilians. And since these bastards only have interest in capturing that idiot, which they won't, we should assist the evacuation. If Straw Hat has been able to evade me for as long as he has, he won't be caught by this lot. Now let's go. In the distance, Mt. Jumble shuddered ominously. The gathered group of pirates and cafe workers stiffened, anticipating the volcano to blow at that second. When nothing happened, they returned their attention to each other. We don't have long before it erupts, Winsdor stated the obvious. There was a rustling in the surrounding shrubs, and Dan and Eustace stumbled forth, seemingly having run from where they'd come from. "Were you followed?" Zoro asked. "Don't think anyone even knew we were there," Eustace replied, "but it's bad. That explosion just before was them. They've rigged the volcano to go off at any moment." Quote, "How did they do something like that?" Nami asked. The two proceeded to explain what they'd seen and heard in the Forbidden Port. "So they're planning on leaving people behind," Brooke said once they were done. "Yes," Dan replied, "that's why they've prompted the volcano to come early in the first place." "What are we going to do about it?" Zoro asked. "Well, they have Catherine at any rate," Eustace said. "We're not leaving her there, so we shouldn't leave anyone else there too. Besides, once we've set them free, I'm sure those slaves will be willing to join our cause. We'll need to be able to get out of here once we're done," Windsor said. "Our ship is undetected. Once we get to ours, we'll be able to make it to yours." "You," Frankie noted, "you're like me, aren't you?" Quote. Windsor paused and eyed Frankie with a grin. "Well, what do you know? It really does take one to know one." "Huh?" Usopp questioned, glancing between the two. "You mean you're a pervert too?" Exclamation mark. Quote. "A what?" Windsor questioned flatly as Frankie brushed off what he perceived as a compliment. "I don't think that's what he was talking about," Nami said. "He's a cyborg," Frankie said once he was done reacting to Usopp's question. "I could tell from when we met him at the cafe the other day. He's a lot less super than I am, but a bit like me. Aren't you, bro?" Quote. "It's true, most of my modifications are interior," Windsor said, "but at the very least, I'm a semi-cyborg." "That's so cool." Luffy applauded. "Can you shoot beams?" Quote. "No." "Huh? Then what's the point of being a pervert?" Quote. "What?" Exclamation mark. "Who said anything about being a pervert?" Quote. Chopper tilted his head. "But isn't a cyborg and a pervert the same thing?" Quote. "Alright," said Sanji once a basic plan had been run through a few times, "is the plan clear to everyone?" Quote. "Yosh," replied Luffy, "I should let Ichigo know about this, see ya." Quote. And he shot off before anyone could stop him. Must he always do that? Nami sighed. "It can't be helped," Zoro said, "just let him go, and trust that he'll know what he's doing eventually." "Alright," said Dan, "cyborgs, see to the ship issue. The rest of you, either prepare to meet the Marines on shore, or stay back here. Wait for my signal either way. We're going to infiltrate Port 4. You and I just did that," Eustace pointed out. "Shut up, you're ruining the mood." Dan snapped. "As I was saying, we'll be infiltrating Port 4. Ichigo slashed the dark katana through the air as several Marine officers advanced on him. He wouldn't give them any opportunity to capture any of his friends if he could help it. With the utterance of a low-level Kido, a few of the officers were sent sprawling through the air, though it didn't seem to lessen their numbers any. There were so many. "Damn it," Ichigo muttered. "How many people can they fit on those boats?" Quote. Another 6 officers charged at him and he disabled them with a swish of his sword. It wasn't like any of them had been tough fighters so far, but their numbers were tedious. As Ichigo busied himself with another patch of frontliners, he noticed another 7 or 8 approaching him from the side. He quickly dispatched half the officers he was engaging with, though still found himself in no position to fend them off at that given moment. However, before he could flash step into the sky to gain further advantage, the approaching Marines were sent flying through the air, and not from any action Ichigo had made. Confused, Ichigo glanced over in the direction of the disturbance. "Really, Ichigo?" Sanji berated him, hands in pockets and a leg angled up in the air, having just dealt the hopeful attackers a flying kick. "I would have hoped you knew us better by now." There was a flash of blades and another group of attacking marines were incapacitated to Ichigo's left. "You think we're gonna leave all the fight for you?" Zoro questioned. "Don't just say something vague and then run off so suddenly like that. You really think we're gonna listen to you?" Quote. Noticing a group of marines advancing towards him, Ichigo prepared to fight them off. But an overhead, whizzing sound announced a series of green pebble-like objects as they were shot over his head. Giant flytrap-like plants effectively spawned where they landed, proceeding to snare up the advancing marines before they could reach him. Ichigo looked over his shoulder to see Usopp approaching, powerful slingshot in hand. "It can't be helped though," the sniper addressed his two crewmates with a sigh, "as Luffy and I have said, you can't stop children from being brash and reckless." Ichigo watched as the three of them continued to hold off the advancement of marine officers easier than one would a simple hollow. "Aren't you guys going to leave any for me?" He deadpanned as one of the flytraps regurgitated a marine, sending him rocketing into the ocean from where he groggily latched onto a ladder by one of the ships. "Not if you don't get some for yourself," Zoro responded, dispatching another 4 marines at once. "We're here now," Sanji said, "so don't go thinking you can send us away." "Yeah," Ichigo said with a smile, thinking back to the times in Shangpyo and before when the crew had collectively aided one another in bringing a group of enemies down. "I guess I should have known better." He then scanned their small gathered group. "Where is Luffy anyway?" Quote. Zoro shrugged. "He ran on ahead to find you. He probably got lost on the way, that idiot." "You'd be even more lost than he is if you hadn't come with us," Usopp pointed out. "Anyway, what's the situation?" Ichigo asked. "Well," began Sanji, sending a few more officers through the air, "as you can see, the marines are here. The volcano's gonna blow soon too." The volcano? Ichigo looked over at the dark shape of MT. "Jumble in the dimming sky, but isn't it? The Tenryubito rigged it to suit them," Zoro said, proceeding to explain the situation more in depth. "They can't do that," Ichigo stated once he was done. "They can," Usopp said, spawning a few more fly-eaters in the marines' direction. "Try and stop them and they'll come for your soul." "So? I've had worse things come for it before," Ichigo remarked. "The ship is probably blocked off," Sanji said. "Frankie and that Windsor guy went to check it out, because they're both perverts." Ichigo opted now was not the time to ask. "But Dan and some of the others are planning on infiltrating Port 4 at some point," Sanji continued. "I'm not completely sure of the details, but that's where the slaves are being kept. If you want to bust them out, no one's going to stop you." "These guys might try," Zoro said, indicating to the swarming marines. "But you won't let them," Ichigo said, before once again gazing in the direction of MT. "Jumble, since the volcano will be erupting soon, those jerks' plan will be coming to action. If you want to help the slaves out, I'm pretty sure some of the others are going to infiltrate the port soon. You might be helpful when it comes to whatever enemies get past us and the others." "Where can I find them?" Ichigo asked. "They're at the Roostersaurus's hill. Probably gonna leave soon. That's why some of us need to stay back and hold off these guys. Also, you might run into Luffy at some point." "Okay then. There's 2 more sets of ships up and down the coast, by the way," Ichigo told them. "Will that be a problem?" Quote. already on it. Some of the others are dealing with them, Zoro said. Speaking of which, I'll go and assist Robin-chan and Chopper. I think they're on their own, Sanji said as he sprang down the beach. Careful, we don't know where the strong guys are, Usopp cautioned after him. Obviously not here, Zoro commented as he boredly flicked away a couple more attackers. Do what you want, Ichigo, but don't do anything stupid. Right, Ichigo said with a nod. We can take care of these guys, Usopp said. You should go to the others and join them when they bust out the people in Port 4. Frankie and Windsor are working on getting the ships out, so they'll probably find something for the people to escape on. Alright. I'll leave this lot to you then, Ichigo said. And with one last glance, he turned and flash-stepped down the coast. Luffy ran through the trees. Literally. Damn it, Ichigo. Where did you run off to? He called out in frustration, toppling down more of the forest in his search. He was thinking about heading back the way he came, when several sets of footsteps caught his attention. Looking over in the direction of the sound, he discovered a score of Marines emerging in the forest. You really do make yourself an easy target, don't you, Straw Hat Luffy? The Marine at the front questioned. Do you guys know where the coast is? Luffy asked, I'm trying to find my friend so I can tell him something. The Marine looked slightly taken aback. Why are you asking us? Quote. Well, I'm not going to ask the trees. Good point, the Marine said before smiling, but I'm not going to tell you. Really? Luffy asked, tilting his head, then I'm going to have to make you tell me. Ichigo watched the scores of Marines scurrying beneath him as he stepped through the sky. Weren't any of them aware of the volcano? Surely they were, with the warning sirens sounding and the constant rumbling of the mountain. But still, the Marines' motive seemed unanimous: capture the Straw Hats and nothing more. We capture them and then we leave. That's the plan, Ichigo had heard one say. Nothing about evacuations. But wasn't that the sort of thing the Marines were supposed to help with? Ichigo recalled reading part of a booklet about the evacuations earlier in the week, and there was defiantly mentions of Marine personnel coming along to assist civilians. But that wasn't what he was seeing right now. The evacuation wasn't meant to occur for another week or so. That explosion had been caused by the Tenryubito, and if that new alarm was of any indication, MT. Jumble would be erupting within the hour. As if on cue, a low, yet resounding groaning of the earth rumbled from the direction of the mountains, as volcanic tension festered beneath their rocky surfaces. Ichigo scanned his gaze across the island. Atlantica's people were out in the street, hurriedly gathering provisions, rushing to seal away their homes from what would soon be empty. Jumble's sulfuric wrath. They were barely given any warning, he thought. He remembered the scratchy details the other three had given him on the matter. The Tenryubito had detonated explosive materials beneath the seabed, triggering a disturbance in the crust and prompting the volcano to erupt prematurely. Their reasoning was to get rid of the slaves they didn't want anymore. They were planning on leaving them in a cell to suffocate on the volcano's toxic fumes as they swamped the island in a few hours' time. It made him feel sick. The people had to be evacuated or they die here too. The Marines seemed only concerned in what the world nobles wanted them to do. But there was barely any time. The volcano could blow at any moment. Something by the shore caught his eye. A series of large ships were docked and ready to set immediately. Groups of civilians below hurried in the direction of the ships, many scurrying aboard with the help of people dressed in the familiar blue and white of the Marine uniform. So there are people evacuating, Ichigo noted, That's good to see, but weren't the Marines only coming after Luffy and the crew? I thought they had no intention of helping people evacuate. He landed firmly on the ground and stood, at once noticing something different about these Marines. A few of them seemed slightly familiar. Had he seen them before? They were defiantly from a different group to what was currently sweeping the island. But they were still Marines. Glancing around, Ichigo discovered their supervisor. The first thing he noticed about the man was that he was a Marine. The next thing he noticed was that he'd met this Marine before. Ichigo looked the man in the eyes, immediately recognizing him from Zanpakuto. "It's you," he said, "Smoker." Smoker glanced over at him. "Ichigo," he muttered, "what are you doing here?" Quote, "We've been here all week," Ichigo stated. "What are you doing here?" Quote, "What does it look like?" Smoker snapped in response, "I'm trying to get these people off this island before that mountain blows." Ichigo watched as the Marine Vice Admiral continued to usher civilians onto a sleek, fast-looking jet boat, obviously intended to transfer them to a safer place. "You know, it's because of those nobles that this volcano is coming a week early in the first place. They even plan to leave some of their slaves here to die." Smoker seemingly ignored the piece of information as he continued to go about his job. "Well, aren't you going to say anything?" Exclamation mark. Ichigo asked again, "Why do you support something like this? You're a Marine, right? The Marines are supposed to be the good power in this world, aren't they? Then why the hell do you support people like them?" Quote. Again, Smoker chose not to respond. "You seemed like a decent guy, Smoker," Ichigo said with a frown. "I don't understand how someone like you could uphold something like this." "Because, someone like me," Smoker finally interjected, "could change things." Whatever Ichigo may have next chosen to say had been cut off by Smoker's simple reply, and suddenly the situation made more sense. "The world isn't as black and white as most people seem to think it is, Ichigo," Smoker continued. "Don't go thinking that there is a single organization that is entirely good or entirely bad. People are very complex, and there are a lot of gray areas. Remember that." So then, Ichigo began, "If any of those slaves came to the shore and wanted to evacuate, what would you do? Even though the Tenryubito left them to die, would you let them escape this place if you had the choice?" Quote. "Well, hypothetically speaking," Smoker shrugged as he directed another wave of civilians onto the ship, "if those slaves are somehow freed, who am I to deny them safe access off this island? They're just as human as I am." Ichigo digested the Vice Admiral's words, finding them far gentler in nature to what he's been preparing himself for. There was hope still. "Thank you," he said, before turning and flash-stepping into the night without another word. Away from where the G5 Marine Division were evacuating the island's residents, another pair of Marines were fretting over their current situation. "Smoker-san is such a good person," Merlin lamented. "He's a true man." Charlie concurred tearfully. "We thought he was a scary guy at first," Merlin reflected. "And while that's true, he's also a nice person," Charlie finished. "We'll miss him." They both whinged. "Shut up." An officer whose division they were now in commanded. "Apparently the admirals are too far off at the moment," Merlin said, switching his concern to more current matters. "I heard one of them is in battle with Dragon at the moment. So they have two vice admirals coming instead. Vice Admiral Metsumeri and Vice Admiral Daigen." Charlie eeped. "Not those two." Daigen is a ruthless mercenary who'd demote you and send you to the East Blue sooner than you could panic about it. And Metsumeri has some serious issues. I've heard he even narrates his intimate moments with his partner, and apparently one time last year the intercom was on. Quote, I remember that, one of their nearby officers muttered, it was awkward. This is no good though, Merlin said. What are we gonna do without Smoker-san and the rest? I hope they can evacuate the people and get out of here in time. It's not safe here anymore. Toshigi-san said that Smoker-san has always sought his own idea of justice, said Charlie. Maybe it's about time we did that as well. And if we get demoted? Merlin questioned. Well, Smoker-san never got demoted. You're right, what's your plan? Capturing Luffy is Smoker-san's ambition, Charlie said, so maybe we can use this position to our advantage. Yeah. Merlin said, if we can capture him and not give him to any of these Marines, but get him to Smoker-san, think of how happy he'd be. Quote, we'd get promoted. Maybe even higher than that Commodore jerk, and then we'd get to stay with Smoker-san and his crew for good. This is a great idea, Merlin nodded in approval. Just like Smoker-san, we'll follow our own sense of justice. We can change our fate, said Charlie. Robin summoned several arms, all of which morphed into a single giant limb, which could easily swat away the attacking Marines as one would a bothersome fly. Those the arm didn't reach were painfully crippled over by the more life-sized appendages that bloomed on their back, effectively leaving them incapacitated. Having taken down all who were targeting her, Robin stole a glance towards her nakama to see how they were doing. Chopper was currently in Horn Point, rampaging forth and plowing through the gathered Marines, sending them flying. Robin caught herself smiling as the young reindeer pulled himself to his full height, a fair bit taller than usual and appearing almost fully human save for the reindeer-like forearms, and of course the giant pair of antlers that now dominated over his head. He was doing fine. Scanning her gaze across the landscape, Robin noted Sanji easily outmaneuvering and taking down all who opposed him. Of course, if any of the three of them were competent to take care of themselves, it was the cook. Though they'd all grown stronger. Quite a formidable force, it was safe to admit, as she incapacitated yet another officer who charged at her. At the corner of her eye, she noticed Sanji begin to engage in battle with a higher-ranked Marine officer, obviously fairly strong to be able to keep up with him. A gunshot and a shout suddenly re-alerted her to the reality of the situation. Turning, she took in the sight before her. Chopper had been forcibly reverted to Brain Point and lay attempting to struggle on the ground, whilst a dark-colored net encased him. The small reindeer weakly fought against his confines, but it was useless. The net was of sea stone. Robin hurriedly searched across the barrage of Marines, trying to locate the wielder of the net gun. Sanji yelled Chopper's name. His moment of distraction had cost him. His opponent took the opportunity to strike, going straight for the cook's legs, using his ability to coat them in a tough cement-like substance. As a result, Sanji was unable to move his legs as he normally would. Robin braced herself as the only one of the three who remained standing. She could not lose, not in this situation. A sea stone net flew her way, but she sensed it in time and nimbly dodged it, proceeding to cripple all Marines within a 10-meter radius of her. However, this time she didn't notice the Marine sniper somewhere behind her until the sea stone net had swamped her body, and immediately drained her of her energy. Ichigo hadn't even made it back to the planned meeting place, when the intercoms of the island rung throughout the entire city. "We have successfully captured 3 of the Straw Hat crew members," a voice reported. "It is only a matter of time before we capture the rest. Only then may we allow ourselves to leave this island and celebrate our victory." Ichigo felt his blood run cold. Some of them had been caught, and he's promised himself he wouldn't let that happen. He was turning to head back to the shore, when he was grabbed by the shoulder by Dan. "Ichigo," Dan warned, "you wanna get caught too?" Quote. "But the others," Ichigo responded. "Will need us not to get caught if we're gonna bust them out." Within a matter of minutes, the lot of them had regrouped, minus the Sanji, Chopper and Robin team, as well as Luffy, who was likely to be still in the forest somewhere, getting up to who knew what. "This changes things slightly, but our plan is fundamentally the same," Dan said. "They've probably taken your friends to Port 4, where we're headed anyway. I think we may need to make our infiltration force larger now though. Anyone who has abilities they feel might come in useful should come along, but we still need people to stay back and hold the Marines off. I myself will be doing that. We also need a couple to collect the ships. Our boat is unprotected," Eustace said. "It's in an entirely different port as well, so it's easy to get to. All we'll have to do from there is follow some of the skytubes to Little Star Port, and your ship will be in reach." "I'll come with you," Usopp volunteered. "I'll stay and fight the Marines," Ichigo said. "I will too," Zoro seconded. "Alright, you two come with me," Dan said. "We're not going to hold them all off, but we'll do what we can. The rest of you, go with Eustace. Good luck, everyone." And with the final word, the 3 groups set out. "Oi, Ichigo," Zoro's voice sounded as Ichigo and Dan headed back toward the shore. Ichigo turned, to have the swordsman's hand firmly clap him on the shoulder. "You did what any of us would have done back there, with the Tenryubito jerk," Zoro thoroughly assured him. "I'm not going to force you to think either, but it's up to you whether you want to blame yourself for this or not. But at least know that none of us do." The words were reassuring, and Ichigo felt slight relief spill through his veins. Something like this had been bound to happen the moment they first docked in Atlantica, after all. "A light," he said with a nod. It was time to fight back. Chapter 21. Lighting up the sky. For the umpteenth time that night, the earth trembled ominously, causing the citizens of Atlantica to hastily attempt their preparation for what was about to come. Those who had nothing more to do either assisted others, or were ushered to the nearest evacuation pods by G5 Marines. In amongst all the confusion, however, one thing was clear: MT. Jumble was awakening, and could blow at any moment. All across the island, the warning alarms still blared. Citizens ran about making last-minute errands, before gradually clearing out of the city, taking some of the wildlife with them, whilst creatures who'd adapted to volcanic fumes stayed behind in their natural habitats. On the outskirts of the jungle, however, ran a lone figure who was more concerned with other issues. "Finally, I'm out of the forest," Luffy muttered to himself in relief. Those Marines didn't even know where Ichigo went. "But that doesn't matter, I'll find him myself." Somewhere nearby, a group of recently deployed Marines steadily traversed the coastal stretch near the jungle, in keen search of the Straw Hat pirates. "Move it, you two," an officer demanded as he shoved roughly past the 2 new recruits. "You're slowing us down." Charlie and Merlin moved to the side as 5 other officers hurried past, and towards the jungle. "It's no good," Merlin said with a sigh once they were out of earshot. "How are we going to capture Straw Hat with those guys hanging around?" Quote. "Maybe we could get lost," Charlie suggested with a shrug. "They're getting further away from us by the second." If we keep running slowly, they'll leave us behind." "That's a great idea," Merlin commended as they watched the last of the group of Marines disappear into the jungle. "Now we can focus on finding Straw Hat." "But where will we find him?" Charlie lamented. "He's not just going to come running towards us from somewhere up the coast, is he?" Quote, "If only it were that simple, my friend," Merlin said with an exasperated sigh. A figure emerged in the distance, slowly coming closer into view. Merlin laughed. "You know, that guy running toward us kinda looks a bit like Straw Hat." "So he does." Charlie contributed cheerfully as the runner surged nearer. "It looks a lot like him. Even has a hat like his. Same kind of shirt too," Merlin added. "Looks like he has the same color hair as well, and the same height. And that scar looks like the real deal. They could be twins." When the figure was a mere 10 meters from them, it suddenly dawned. "It's him," Merlin whispered. "It's Straw Hat Luffy. He's heading towards us," Charlie noted, a touch of worry evident in his voice. "What should we do?" Quote, "We capture him, of course," Merlin responded, "and then we get him to Smoker Sand." "All right," Charlie said with a nod. "Okay. Prepare yourself. Play it cool." Right. Once Luffy had come even closer, the two took the opportunity to stand in his path. "Straw Hat Luffy," Merlin addressed. Luffy drew to a halt and eyed the two Marines. "I remember you too," he said. "You're those two Marines from Zanpakuto, right? Aren't you with Smokey? I wonder how he's doing. You better prepare yourself, Straw Hat," Merlin warned as he charged toward the young pirate captain. Luffy steadily maneuvered out of the way, dodging the oncoming Marine with ease. Charlie took this opportunity to take his friend's place and prepared himself as Luffy continued running forth. "I hope you're ready, Straw Hat," Charlie said with a sly grin, which suddenly disappeared when he considered the words he'd just spoken. "Actually, I hope you're not." "Huh?" Luffy whirled around to see Merlin charging from a number of meters off. "Get him, Merlin!" Charlie shouted. "Soru," the purple-haired Marine muttered. Whilst Luffy could see this attack coming, he was obviously taken by surprise, and had not prepared himself to counter it. Merlin leapt through the air with bullet-like speed, fist connecting with Luffy's stomach and sending him through the air. Clearly not expecting his opponent to be able to use such a move, Luffy uttered a sound of surprise, before plummeting down into the water with a splash. "Got him," Merlin grinned. The ripples indicating where the pirate had fallen in bubbled in response. "Now what?" Charlie asked. "Well, he's going to drown if we don't do anything," Merlin remarked. "Gya. That's no good." Charlie said, "We can't just let him die." "Gya. You're right." Merlin realized, "We need to give him to Smoker Sand. We've got to get him," Charlie said urgently as he ran for the water. Merlin quickly put out a hand to stop him. "Don't you go in after him," he snapped, "then I'll have to rescue two people." "Oh. That's right," Charlie said, abruptly snapping his hands together. "I'll get him," Merlin said, before diving off the platform. A few moments ticked by before Merlin resurfaced supporting a spluttering Luffy. Charlie knelt down and helped haul the pirate up onto the platform. "Quick, while he's weak," Merlin instructed, pulling himself up, "hold him down." Charlie sat on their captive, restraining his arms whilst Merlin withdrew a pair of seastone handcuffs. "Now hold still, Straw Hat," Merlin instructed, as Luffy lay, still panting from his encounter with the water. "This will all be over quickly." Damn it, how do I get these things open? Merlin muttered as he fumbled with the handcuffs. They worked really well when we tried them out the other day. As Merlin tried to figure out how the handcuffs worked, Luffy began squirming against their grip. Get off, he muttered, struggling as he began regaining a small bit of his strength. It's no good, Straw Hat, Charlie said, you should just give in. Yeah, Merlin concurred, glancing the handcuffs over once again. The less you struggle, the sooner all this will be over. Besides, Charlie continued, still easily restraining their captive, you're not the first of your crew to be captured. Luffy glanced up at them questioningly. What? Quote. Didn't you know? Merlin asked, sitting back and twirling the cuffs on a finger. 3 of your crewmates, not sure who, got captured and taken to the Tenryubito. Now we're not gonna be taking you to them, we'll take you to Smoker-san, so. Merlin was abruptly cut off when he and Charlie suddenly found themselves flying through the air, having been flung off by Luffy's sudden burst of energy. Without another word, the pirate captain was off, charging recklessly ahead and shouting for his nakama. Ah, he got away, Charlie noted as he and Merlin began plunging back downwards. So he did, Merlin replied, as one would discuss the day's weather. A very brief moment went past, in which the two looked one another in the eye and met a sudden and decisive conclusion. Gya. We'll be Damat. The rest of their sentence was drowned out by their immediate contact with the water's surface. Well, this was just shitty. Sanji glanced around the cell he, Robin and Chopper had been taken to after their encounter with the Marines. They were in port number 4 and locked away in a seastone cell, at the mercy of the world nobles. Needless to say, the Marimo would be having a go at him for this later. To make matters worse, he was out of cigarettes. Are your legs going to be okay, Sanji? Chopper asked in concern, eyeing the way the cook's legs had been disabled. Yeah, once I get this stuff off them, Sanji responded through grit teeth as he kicked against the now hardened substance, bashing it against the wall. He wasn't sure what they'd used, but it was far too effective for his liking, even though he was very near freeing himself of it. That's Magnade, Catherine, who conveniently happened to be their cellmate, said with a glance, the base comes from the volcanic springs, but then they add something else to it to add strength. It's strong enough to be annoying, Sanji muttered as he managed to smash the last chunk off, leaving his legs with an uncomfortable sleep-like sensation. Well, at least we're with Catherine Chan, he thought, but getting out's going to be the problem. It's not so bad here, actually, Catherine admitted, once you get over the fact that the Tenryubito are psychotic assholes and we're all going to die if we're not out of here in time. If we're left here for the volcano, we'll suffocate on the fumes, Robin pondered. Well, that's their basic plan, a slave from the adjacent cell commented, to leave us here for the duration of the eruption. It's a good way for them to get rid of us without getting their hands dirty. Sanji scowled at the man's words, not doubting them one fraction. After all, they'd heard the news from Dan and Eustace. But being immersed in the situation themselves made it feel very different and much more real. Are you really surprised? Catherine asked as she traced lines in the soil of the ground. Nobles, in general, all have the same mindset. They believe they're far purer and above any other human. They can do whatever they want, even if it involves killing, and no one bats an eyelid 'cause they're all too afraid. They're cowardly, yet deadly creatures. That sounds about right, Sanji admitted, we've encountered another lot of them before. But that's a different story. What we need to do is work out what to do from here. Has anyone got an escape plan? Quote. He met only silence as a response. No one's considered escaping? He questioned flatly, eyeing the slaves critically. That's not it, a young woman said as she shook her head. Even if we did escape, there's no way we'd be let on the evacuation ships. Sanji momentarily lost track of what he was about to say in favor of fawning over the woman, but decided that now was not the time. As he scanned his gaze across the collection of slaves, he noticed something different about them from the others he'd seen. They didn't have the ghastly explosive contraptions worn by the slaves at the Sabaody archipelago over 2 years prior. None of you are wearing those collars, are you? Quote. The man shook his head. They figured there was no need for that sort of thing, as we'll be dead soon anyway, he said. There's no way of breaking out of these sea stone cells, you know. It might be most effective against the fruit users, but that doesn't mean anyone else can snap it. Have you any idea how strong this substance is? Quote. Sanji grunted a response. If he recalled correctly, not even the idiot Marimo could cut through it last time he tried. Although that was a long time ago, but all the same. You're the one from outside the cafe, aren't you? Catherine asked the man, the one who was with that bastard earlier. Yes, that's me, the man responded, but that fat ass has now decided that we're all expendable. Though I suppose that it's better this way. I'd rather spend my time being dead than serving the likes of them. Quote. The surrounding prisoners jeered in agreement. So you're just going to accept this? Exclamation mark. Chopper questioned, you're willing to die here? Quote. If it means escaping the Tenryubito, then I'll embrace death with open arms, another slave, a young fishman said as others muttered their agreement. Before anyone could respond, footsteps echoed throughout the port. Sanji scowled as the form of a Tenryubito appeared from across the port. Catherine cursed under her breath as the noble and his advisor approached the two cells. Sanji gathered it was the same one that had taken her here to begin with, and looked on in distaste. Welcome, Straw Hat Pirates, the noble, Sarav as Sanji had heard him be referred to as, mocked blatantly as he waddled closer to the cell. Are you well settled? Quote. It seemed the banter the cell provided gave Sarav an extra edge of cockiness and confidence he wouldn't have possessed otherwise. He wouldn't be that damn smart if it weren't for this seastone cage, Sanji thought, wishing he could escape if only to hand the noble what was coming for him. Sarav finally reached their cell and observed them in mild abhorrence from the other side of the bars, though Sanji was pretty sure that he himself was glaring at the noble in a likewise manner. After a few moments, Sarav turned to his advisor. Is this all, Mochu? He demanded impatiently. I'm sure there's more than 3 in the Straw Hat crew. For one thing, I don't even see the one named Straw Hat among them. Nor do I see the one who humiliated me earlier on. The Marines say they're working on it, sire, Mochu said. They will capture more of the Straw Hats before too long. What would you have done with the 3 you've captured so far? Quote. Sarav turned again to the captured pirates. Isn't it obvious? He queried, they're wanted dead or alive after all. It would be a pain to keep them alive when we could simply leave them here with the slaves and let the volcanic fumes do the work for us. Very well, sire, Mochu said. I will see to it that they are not let out, and that the keys to their cell and handcuffs will be heavily guarded. All but one, Sarav corrected. Sorry? See to it that all but one don't get out. Why are we letting one out? Quote. Sarav glared at his advisor. Have you forgotten, you dimwit? He then repeated the phrase, all but one. The utterance seemed to have made more sense to Mochu than it did to Sanji, for in the next moment, the eyes of the advisor snapped wide, as though he suddenly understood something. Right then, sire, I see. Forgive my slowness, it's been a while. Have you decided which yet? Quote. I haven't, Sarav replied, but there's still time. Let's be off. I can't stand being near such scum much longer. Alright then, sire. I agree. And once again, the noble and his associate left their prisoners to ponder amongst themselves. Looks like you'll be joining us in death, then, Catherine said with a wink, so let's enjoy this. You sound like you've given up too, Chopper observed disheartedly. I haven't given up, Catherine said, I'm just not panicking because I know I don't need to. Our friends will come and get us out of here, we just have to wait. After that, butts will be kicked. You're right, Chopper realized, there's no way the others would let them go through with this. Quote. If we could get out of here, Sanji speculated, glancing from the walls to the water that surrounded them in the vast indoor boathouse. Though I wonder what they meant by, all but one. A silence descended onto the inside of the port, as each of its occupants considered their possible alternatives to death. You know, the fishman said after a short while, we're happier to die here than serve the Tenryubito any longer. Although if there were something that would make us happier, it would be to leave this place and be given our lives back. A number of the slaves murmured their agreement, some mentioning things about family, friends, or nakama whom they wished to see again. Then it's settled, Sanji said conclusively, we're all going to get out of here alive one way or another. He turned to his nakama. Robin-chan, are you okay? He asked, noting how she'd been silent for most of the duration they'd been in the cell. Those shitty nobles locking us up in this damned cell. You're not too uncomfortable, are you? Quote. Of course not, she said with a smile. We just need to trust that the others will find us before we're killed by the volcano. Our nakama will come, Chopper said decisively. That's right, Sanji said, right now, they're probably kicking several asses just to get here and bust us out. We have to trust them. And then we can all be free of this shitty place. Luffy ran, a whole new drive prompting him to push his legs faster and faster. Those Tenryubito bastards had some of his nakama, and he'd sooner turn himself over than let his crewmates become subject to the likes of them. He pushed himself to run even faster, though he was not particularly sure of where he needed to be. Where would the Marines have taken his nakama anyway? Probably to that fourth port place, wherever that was. Luffy would just have to find it. Finding Ichigo could wait for the time being. As he hurried past a mass of buildings and up a hill, a group of nearby voices alerted him to the presence of other keen would-be rescuers. No, Frankie. Nami's voice sounded above the others. Breaking down the walls of the port wouldn't be super at all. We want to do this subtly without attracting unwanted attention. Same thing goes for you, cafe boy. Quote. Winsdoor made a disappointed sound in response. But Nami-san, Brooke's voice reasoned, there are 4 of us involved in this rescue mission. It will be pretty difficult to be subtle about anything with this number, Yoho. Quote. 4 isn't all that many. Nami insisted. Luffy rounded a bend of overgrown ferns to see 3 of his nakama, plus Winsdoor squatting beside a broad-trunked tree. Guys! He shouted, waving an arm up at them. The group turned at the sound of his voice, noticing him immediately as he came rocketing toward them. Luffy. Nami stammered after he'd slammed into the tree and gotten to his feet. Robin, Chopper and Sanji-kun were taken. Quote. I heard, Luffy said, some of the Marines told me some of you had been captured. Do you know where they took them? Quote. To that fourth port place, Frankie relayed, we're going there now. We'll bust them out with cannons if we have to. Nami sighed. Well, I guess now that Luffy's here, any plan of being subtle has flown out the window. We'll stick to the original plan as much as possible anyway, Winsor said, so I'll quickly go ahead and scout out what's in our way. I'll be right back. Oi, wait. Luffy called after him, I'm going too. Quote. Before he could race on ahead, however, a tremor shook the earth, stronger than the ones that had been recurring over the past hour. It stopped him before he could take another step. Already, Luffy knew that this one would be different. In the distance, Mt. Jumble was shaking. A rumble like an earthquake, a sound louder than a thunderstorm, and an explosion that lit up the sky. The gathered Straw Hats watched as the silhouette of Mt. Jumble made itself easily distinguishable from its place on the horizon line. The surface of the mountain erupted upwards, and a vast column of gas spurted far up into the atmosphere, creating a quickly expanding cloud which gradually crept across the night sky, blotting the recently appeared stars from view. Glowing molten rock spewed into the air, causing the night to appear almost like the day. Oh, what a sight! Brook exclaimed from where he was seated by the tree trunk, an actual volcanic eruption. I can't believe my eyes. Not that I have any, yo-ho-ho. Quote. Amazing, Nami breathed, temporarily sidetracked by the natural phenomena. A stream of lava slowly began leaking down the side of the mountain and toward the ocean, its radiant heat causing it to glow and stand out, even at such a distance. Luffy watched the spectacle, a sick knot twisting in his gut as a dull throbbing pounded from the scar on his chest, causing a lump to form in his throat. He quickly looked away and refocused on his nakama. Alright, so where's the port? Quote. It's not far, said Frankie, Win's bro has just gone to check if there's anything in our way. We don't have all that much time, you know. Nami watched the sky, as gases from the volcano steadily wafted over, towards the city. That might become a problem for us later, she said with a frown, before withdrawing her climatact and pointing it at the sky. Stratocumulus shield. Quote. A thick swath of glowing white cloud shot out from the climatact, spreading rapidly once it hit the sky. Soon, most of the city was encased by the cloud, which sat much like a dome overhead, though still allowed clear visibility of the outside night, particularly the raging volcano in the distance. Hurried footsteps announced the return of Winsor, clearly put on edge by the eruption of Mt. Jumble. He clanked at the sky, and to Nami's climatact. What's this? He asked, intrigued. Nami lowered the staff and observed her handiwork. It should hold for a few hours, she said, it will block out most of the fumes for now. I don't quite understand, but Yash, good work. Luffy commended her, before turning to the rest, we're going to get our nakama back, he said firmly, and this volcano isn't going to stop us. The onslaught against the Marines paused for the briefest of moments as Mt. Jumble lit up the sky in a flurry of heat. Ichigo looked on in fascination as the volcano erupted, having only ever seen such things in movies or books. Now wasn't the time to be distracted, however. They had to hold the Marines off for as long as possible. Dan fought with some flame-throwing ability. Ichigo hadn't witnessed its entirety due to busily being locked in combat himself. Nearby, El Santino nipped at any Marine who threatened him. Currently, he was attached to the buttocks of one particularly unfortunate officer, who proceeded to run around in panic, causing the plesiosaur fastened to his behind to knock over fellow marine bystanders with its bulbous body. Zoro was furthest from him, easily fending off anyone who tried to infiltrate the small blockade they had created. As the fighting resumed, Ichigo briefly took note of a thick, non-volcanic cloud forming over the city, creating a banter between the people and the volcanic smoke which was currently spreading further up in the atmosphere. But this wasn't the only post-eruption oddity. A moment went by and the Marines suddenly cleared off. A single figure stepped forward from the bay, the surrounding Marines hurrying out of his way. Ichigo and Zoro looked on at the new arrival as he glided forth. Vice Admiral Metsumeri requests his opponent's leniency, the man spoke, as Metsumeri has never before witnessed the eruption of a volcano, and has found this experience exhilarating. Well, good for him, Ichigo said. I guess he's still watching the eruption then, in that case? Quote, Metsumeri is no longer watching the volcano, the officer replied. Who are you anyway? Ichigo asked, his spokesperson or something? I think if this Metsumeri guy is actually serious about fighting us, he'd come to us himself. Oh, but Metsumeri has, the man responded. In fact, Metsumeri is watching you right now. Huh? Ichigo stared at the man. It's him, Zoro muttered. How can you tell? Ichigo asked. His name is sewn on his collar, Dan said, indicating to the fluorescent-colored threaded scrawl that adorned the left fold of the officer's upper shirt. Oh, said Ichigo, I see. The collar of his shirt is not the only item of clothing Metsumeri has given to the embroiders to label. The officer, now clearly Vice Admiral Metsumeri, said to them as he continued his advance. People in this world are so strange, Ichigo thought to himself, losing count of the number of times he'd had that thought as Metsumeri somersaulted forth, landing in a questionable pose. Metsumeri will now use his secret technique, in which he will soar forth and unveil the blade that has been hidden in his coat, taking his opponents by surprise, as they may have thought he was unarmed. Quote, well, it's not so secret now, Dan remarked. He just told us what he's about to do, Ichigo voiced in disbelief. Sure enough, the Vice Admiral attacked in the precise way he had just described. Ichigo, Zoro, Dan, and even El Santino evaded the attack with ease, having been verbally prepared for it by the attacker himself. Metsumeri cannot begin to comprehend how his secret attack was ineffective. Metsumeri said, running a hand through his fly-away straw hair as he pounded at the soil with his now revealed sword. He wonders what kinds of wild powers his opponents must have in order to anticipate his movements. It was no skill on our part, Ichigo said dismissively. You explained in every detail what you were about to do before you did it. But Metsumeri will not let this small mishap get to him. He will now reveal his sword's special secret power. The one where he fires fine steel wire from the hilt to grant it stronger reach. Quote, are you serious? Ichigo deadpanned. He did it again, Zoro said blankly as the attack was again sidestepped with ease. Ichigo glanced at the sharp steel wire that rocketed past where he'd been recently standing. Idiocy aside, this opponent had a dangerous weapon. But he was willing to fight. I'll fight him, he informed the others. He's just an idiot, I don't think he'll need help. Metsumeri will not let his guard down this time, the Vice Admiral assured them, preparing once again to narrate his not-so-secret battle tactics. Finally, the trembling in the ground of the fourth port died down. The resounding explosion from several minutes prior still rang freshly in the ears of the prisoners. "Do you think that was the volcano?" Chopper asked. "What else could it have been?" Sanji responded. "It's only a matter of time before the fumes reach us," Robin commented. Several sets of footsteps echoed around the port, announcing the return of Sarav and Mochu, plus an array of guards from the palace. "They're back," Catherine said darkly. "They're still here?" Sanji questioned. "I thought they would have evacuated by now for sure." "Normally, we would," Mochu said as they approached, "but the toxic fumes won't reach us for a while, and there's still one last thing that needs to be done." He turned to his master, who was staring at the cell of slaves. "Have you decided yet, sire?" Quote. Sarav gazed at the cell's occupants for a moment longer, before reaching a final verdict. "None will do," he dismissed, turning his back on the cell of slaves, instead focusing his attention on his new captives, viewing them all critically from behind the glass of the bubble-like helmet over his head. "Their bounty posters," he requested of his assistant. Mochu withdrew 4 slips of paper from his robes, displaying them to his master, who looked on decisively. Eventually, Sarav glanced up from the posters, seemingly having made up his mind. "The woman," he said, indicating to Robin. "What are you doing?" Exclamation mark. Sanji demanded. The gate of the cell was swung open, and Robin was led out. "You'd better not hurt her." Quote. "What are you going to do with her?" Chopper asked. Sarav eyed them with a twisted snarl. "Clearly you didn't know," he said, "about this island's tradition." "Tradition?" Sanji repeated. "Tradition," Catherine repeated with a frown. "You can't mean, but wasn't that outlawed years ago?" Exclamation mark. Quote. "As far as commoners like yourselves know, yes it was," Mochu responded. "What are you talking about?" Sanji asked. "What's going on?" Quote. "You're talking about the sacrifice, aren't you?" Robin spoke. A silence descended upon the port, broken only by far-off battle sounds and volcanic rumbles. "Ah, she's a smart one," Mochu said. "It was never outlawed, was it?" Robin questioned further. "It's still been in action during every volcanic eruption at this island." "Yes," Sarav said, "but we're above the law, and those who have found out have ended up dead anyway. Much like all of you will be soon." "Give Robin-chan back," Sanji yelled. "Oh, you might get her back once we're done," Sarav assured. "What's left of her, at least." Zoro watched as Ichigo's battle against the Vice Admiral slowly rose in intensity. The clashing of blades seemed to drown out the sound from all other places. He watched carefully, his hand never leaving the hilt of Wado Ichimonji in case he needed to use it. That Metsumeri guy seemed to be more than happy to fight them both at once whilst the other marines stood their ground or attempted to slip past Dan, himself, or El Santino. Watching Ichigo fight from the outside like this was a lot different from experiencing it directly, as Zoro had so far done. When he wasn't the one the Shinigami was fighting, it was as though he could see more and less at the same time. He had better view of Ichigo's antics and reactions in relation to his opponent. But the communication that came with being directly immersed in battle together, the fighting spirit that was between the two opponents was far more vague, as Zoro was not the one Ichigo was currently locked in combat with. As such, Metsumeri was probably experiencing it right now. Although the Marine was busily narrating other happenings, such as what move he was going to enact next, his thoughts on Ichigo's hair color, and anything in between. It seemed Ichigo had had enough of this, however. Getsuga Tenshou. He thundered, dragging the blade downwards through the air and towards Metsumeri. Nothing happened. Metsumeri waits for something to happen, the marine commentated. Ah, Ichigo murmured, force of habit, Hado number 33. Quote. The ringer for disaster fired from the katana, visibly taking Metsumeri by surprise as it blew you inelegantly. Metsumeri ponders his opponent's actions and now prepares to unleash his other secret technique in which he zigzagged through the air and jumped behind his opponent, taking him by surprise. Quote. This again, Ichigo sighed. After all, this would be the third time Metsumeri had let one of his now not-so-secret techniques spill forth. Zoro observed as Metsumeri's stance changed and he went into attack. But something wasn't right, something seemed off. Metsumeri's words and intentions were not matching, and Ichigo didn't have a clue. Ichigo. Look out. Zoro warned, his observational haki abilities allowing him to see something the Shinigami could not. Huh? Ichigo responded. The Vice Admiral used Soru to approach Ichigo in a fraction of a second, and make a move drastically different from the one he had just described. Metsumeri lied. Before Ichigo could counteract, Metsumeri's steel wire entangled his upper arm. The blade proceeded to hack through the skin above his left shoulder. A thick turret of blood splurged forth from the affected area, as Metsumeri continued to shove the sword deeper. Ichigo grimaced, the pain evident in his features, barely managing to wrench himself free of the painful ensnarement, blood dripping profusely from his fresh wound. His borrowed katana was still clutched tightly by his good arm, which trembled slightly. Zoro regarded Ichigo's stance. Like himself, it was clear the substitute Shinigami was no stranger to such wounds. But all the same, the wound would soon be a hindrance if left unattended. Metsumeri landed a hit. The Vice Admiral chanted victoriously. Zoro's attention suddenly shot back to Ichigo when the katana clattered to the ground. Oi Ichigo, he said, what are you, shit? Though a well-weathered swordsman and highly experienced in the suffrage of several types of injury, Zoro had not prepared himself for what he was about to see. It took all the discipline he had mastered over the years to remain focused once he glimpsed the true extent of Ichigo's injury. To state that, there was a lot of blood, barely even began to cover it. The boy's entire right arm dangled limp and lifeless, Metsumeri's attack having split through skin, sinew and even bone. Zoro didn't have a lot of medical knowledge, but he could tell even the nerves had been severed. The arm had essentially been completely sliced off, save for the fine unharmed flap of skin from which it was currently hanging. He felt himself grimacing as Ichigo's good arm clasped tightly to the injured one, clearly an effort to keep the limb from coming off altogether. Metsumeri will now finish his opponent off, the Vice Admiral informed them, charging at Ichigo once again. The substitute Shinigami barely managed to dodge the attack, his good arm desperately clenching the almost severed one in place, and his body trembling beyond his control. Metsumeri notices his opponent is slowing down. Before the Vice Admiral could launch another attack, Zoro stood firmly in his way. I'll take it from here, he said, maintaining his coolness. Dan, make sure Ichigo doesn't die on us. He unsheathed his katanas, placing the hilt of Wado Ichimonji firmly in his mouth, and tightly gripping Shisui and Sandai Kitetsu as he rushed at the Vice Admiral. Dan knelt at Ichigo's side, doing what he could with his mild medical knowledge to slow the bleeding and reduce shock. But right now, Zoro needed to focus on his opponent. Chopper would patch Ichigo up once all this was over. All he would have to do was endure. His and Metsumeri's blades clashed in a flurry of blows, all of which were narrated enthusiastically by the Vice Admiral. Zoro set all other thoughts aside and set himself on the sole purpose of defeating his opponent. However, things would not be so simple. "Hey, Ichigo." Dan's voice suddenly penetrated his thoughts. "What are you doing? Get back down. You shouldn't be moving." Zoro whirled around, only to see Ichigo rising to his feet. "Oi, Ichigo," he shouted, "you idiot, get back down. I've got this." Quote. But Ichigo did not seem to be listening. In fact, Ichigo didn't seem to be himself at all. His composure had changed drastically. "Ichigo?" An unfamiliar voice questioned from the body of the Shinigami he'd come to know, as a very un-Ichigo grin adorned his features. What was going on? Zoro's attention flickered Ichigo's wounded arm, and he looked on in grotesque fascination. First, the clear-cut bones reassembled themselves. Then came the veins and arteries, the muscle and finally the skin, sewing itself back together as though nothing more than a rag doll. He was healing at a ridiculous speed. Regenerating. "Ah yes, you're wondering about King." The voice from Ichigo's body spoke again. "Well, he isn't here at the moment. Reckless idiot, always trying to get killed. If he dies, it's a problem for me too." "Who are you?" Zoro asked. Not Ichigo surveyed him through a pair of gold-irised, black-swathed eyes. "I am someone without a name." Chapter 22. Sharp tongue, dull mind. There was no way around it. The port was surrounded. Marine officers were lined all around the structure, pacing back and forth, chatting amongst themselves. "How are we supposed to get in?" Usopp whispered his question across to Eustace from where they hid in a tuft of bushes. "I'm working on that," Eustace said, his mind working overtime. "Are you sure there's a way to get to Little Starport from here?" Quote. "Of course. All the ports are connected in some way." "Ah yes, because of those tubes. I've seen. Why are they guarding this one?" Quote. "Maybe they guessed we might do this. At any rate though, the guard here won't be as tough as the one they'd have at the port your ship is in." "I guess that's right," Usopp said as they watched some of the Marines beginning to pass around gas masks. "It must be getting bad," Eustace muttered, "even some of the Marines are leaving. We better start moving, I have a plan." Usopp knelt in to listen. "You distract them, I'll sneak in." "Why do I have to distract them?" Quote. "You look like a distracting kind of guy." "Fine." A moment later, Usopp stepped out into sight of the Marines. "Who's that?" One of the officers asked, "Is that one of the Straw Hats?" Quote. "I believe it's Sogeking of the Straw Hat Pirates," another one of them said as Eustace quietly slipped behind them and into the port. "Really?" Another asked, "I thought Sogeking wore a mask." Usopp looked around to see all the officers were now focused on him. "Ha." He laughed, "That's right. It is I, the mighty Sogeking." The Marines then began to brandish their weapons and he frowned. He'd left most of his pop green weaponry on the sunny. "Looks like I'll have to improvise," he thought to himself as the surrounding Marines prepared to attack. "Usopp spell," he shouted. The Marines lowered their weapons slightly and looked on in confusion. "Right," "Now's my chance." He cleared his throat and said in a nice, loud voice so he'd be heard by all. "Tiny razor blades slicing between your little toes." Quote. Just when he was beginning to worry his ingenious attack may have been ineffective, a pained cry of, "That sounds way too painful," sounded from nearby and he found himself grinning. At least the attack had worked on one. However, he lost the grin when he realized it had been Eustace. "Block your ears, dimwit," he shouted in the direction of his ship-collecting partner. Then he realized that he was supposed to be distracting the Marines from him and quickly set back to work. Paper cuts on that bit of skin in your elbow joint," he tried, indicating to his own elbow joint, so the Marines would know where to feel the pain. Surprisingly, this time was effective. Amidst the cries of, "No, not the paper cut," Eustace's signal could be heard. Usopp quickly ran into the port before any of the Marines could recover and clambered aboard the ship Eustace had bought out. The ship was a lot smaller than the Sunny, or even the Mary. Though it was clearly meant for a smaller number of people. As Usopp boarded, he turned to see Eustace applauding, a look of wonder on his face. "That was a mighty powerful spell," he said. "Got any other tricks?" Quote. "What do you think this is?" Exclamation mark. Usopp questioned him, "Some kind of show?" Quote. Eustace shrugged, before looking down into the wild, churning water of the tube before them. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No, but okay," Usopp gulped. Eustace steered the ship and they descended into the first tube, which would, hopefully, lead them to the Sunny. The nameless entity that had taken charge of Ichigo's body drew its black-irised golden eyes to its opponent, who ogled as he looked on. "Metsumeri does not know what to make of this new development," the Vice Admiral said, sounding notably surprised. Usually when he near severs an opponent's arm, that arm does not reattach itself. "You're the Hollow, aren't you?" Zoro questioned, recalling having heard something about it from Ichigo. The strange eyes met Zoro's own good one for a moment, and Zoro realized he needn't have asked that question. What else could this be but the Hollow Ichigo had spoken of on that night a few weeks prior? He watched as Ichigo returned his focus to the Vice Admiral. The Hollow steadily knelt down, its movements livid and eerie. Zoro noticed bone-like fragments materializing across Ichigo's facial features, much like the Vizard mask. But this was different. This was not Ichigo. Its right hand curled around the hilt of the discarded katana, and at once Zoro sensed a harsh wave of killing intent. Then it moved. Metsumeri is. Metsumeri was suddenly and abruptly cut off by his opponent's sudden spike in power as the Hollow rushed towards him, swinging the blade with a manic cackle. The Vice Admiral barely had the time to parry the blow with his own swing, grimacing somewhat at his opponent's strength. He and the Hollow stood still for a moment, the metallic grind of steel pressing steel causing the muscles in their arms to flex, and their eyes locked in contact. "Zoro," Dan's voice shouted from where he held off a few stray Marines, "what's with Ichigo? He sounds a bit too happy." The swordsman briefly contemplated how to explain the matter to someone else, when he wasn't quite sure himself. "It's complicated," he said. "He's, not Ichigo." Zoro's attention snapped back to the fight when a particularly strong shove from the Hollow broke through the melee stalemate. Metsumeri is surprised, the Vice Admiral managed to report, before the Hollow charged at him once again. Its moves were reckless and without defense, focusing the entirety of its purpose on attacking its opponent, no matter the bodily cost. Not that Metsumeri was managing to get many of his attacks in anyway. The hollow blocked any and all the Vice Admiral through its way. "I can't believe how much of a mindless idiot you were back there, Ichigo," the hollow addressed its host, as though he were standing beside Zoro and not sharing a body, "losing ya Zanpakuto like that back there. Ain't ya supposed to be a Shinigami? How do you even manage to lose a Zanpakuto?" Metsumeri is confused as to why his opponent is suddenly talking to himself. Metsumeri managed to make a comment, which Zoro found vaguely ironic. "And then there's this idiot," the hollow continued. Its focus back to Metsumeri. "A bumbling fool in my eyes. And yet you were pretty damn useless back there without the old man to back yaw up." Zoro wasn't entirely sure who the old man the hollow was referring to was, but based on earlier conversations with Ichigo, he guessed it was the spirit of Zangetsu. "I'll tell ya what though, King," the hollow said, "don't worry about having to fight this guy any longer. This will be over quick smart." "Damn it," Sanji cursed, kicking at the bars of the cell uselessly, "this isn't good. How are we going to save Robin?" Chopper wailed as he desperately took hold of the sea stone bars, sapping his strength. "You're going to need a key for starters," Catherine said in an attempt to be helpful. "What are they going to do to Robin?" Chopper asked tearfully, sliding to the floor. "They'll take her to the cliffs, I'd imagine, the slave from earlier," Jard said. "It's one of their shielded areas after all." "I'm surprised the nobles haven't evacuated yet though," Chopper said. "They don't need to hurry like anyone else," the fishman contributed. "Their palace and other places of theirs are protected from it. They have shielded areas. If they really wanted to, they could stay at their palace for an entire eruption and everything would be fine." "It's really expensive though," Jared said. "There was talk years ago about getting the protective shielding for the entire city to lower the stress to escape during eruptions. But the only places that got it were the places the Tenryubito wanted. And those were places only they visited. Most of which weren't even used during eruptions. They could have easily had at least the Mesozoic district covered. That would have been enough to shelter the whole population. But the Tenryubito aren't exactly people who keep the citizens in mind." A loud blast suddenly echoed throughout the port as part of one of the far walls exploded inwards, scattering debris across the floor for several meters. After a moment, the highly distinguishable form of Frankie became visible in the settling dust. "Nice one," Windsor complimented as he appeared beside the other cyborg, eyes wide in awe. "I can't do one like that, but I can do this." Windsor bent his right arm back, over his shoulder. It clicked into place at the odd angle as though it was meant to, before a sleek gun-like barrel appeared in the pit of his arm. He proceeded to needlessly fire into another wall. "That's so cool." Luffy ogled at the pair of them as he clambered through the newly made opening. Over here, guys," Sanji said, waving a hand at them. "So much for wanting a subtle entrance," Nami sighed as she entered through the rubble, followed by Brook. "Nami Swan," Sanji called, his composure suddenly changing upon her arrival. "You've come to save me. This means you love me, doesn't it?" Quote. "Hello Catherine," Windsor waved at his friend. "It's about time you got here," his friend responded with a smirk. "Where's Robin?" Nami asked, her gaze scanning the gathered prisoners. Sanji's composure changed once again. "Robin was taken," he explained. "Those shitty Tenryubito bastards are going to sacrifice her. So forget us for now." Bring Robin-chan back, make sure she doesn't get hurt. We can't stick around here when they have Robin, Nami admitted, but we can't just leave you here either. Does anyone know where the keys are kept? I'll get you out of here while the others get Robin. Luffy frowned. Where did they take her? Quote, to the cliffs, we'd imagine, one of the slaves contributed, the ones just east of here. I know the ones you're talking about, Windsor said, they'd be the ones with the shielding, right? Quote, those are the ones. Makes sense, Windsor nodded, that's where the sacrifices used to be taken when the act was still known about, but no one really goes there anymore. It doesn't surprise me that the Tenryubito would still do this though. Then let's go, Luffy said, we don't have a lot of time, Nami, will you be able to get the keys? Quote, yes, Nami assured and turned to the prisoners, just tell me where they are. It's dangerous, you know, a slave told her. No more dangerous than the alternative, Nami said, besides, this is my line of work. Alright then, Jared said, inclining his head towards a hallway that veered off from the port's main interior, head down that corridor. The third room on the right is where you'll find the key. We're running out of time, so try to avoid a fight if you can. Nonetheless, prepare yourself just in case. Alright, Nami said, withdrawing the claim attacked, I won't take long. Nami-san is so cute when she's being courageous, Sanji cooed from behind the bars. Nami ignored him and ran for the room she'd been told of. We'll stop the sacrifice, Luffy said, let's go. Mount. Jumble simmered in the distance, the molten rocket blasted into the atmosphere causing streaks of light in the sky, making it bright like the day. The protective cloud Nami had produced was working well, but was slowly thinning as time went by. Some of the weaker Marines that had been assigned to the retaliation against the Straw Hats were evacuating with the last of Atlantica's citizens before the volcanic fumes could become too insufferable to them. But that didn't matter right now. Not to the four figures indiscreetly hurrying in the direction of the cliffs. Their overall speed didn't even slower when an obstacle appeared in their way. A large, broad man stood before them, hands behind his back as he observed them from his height. Out of the way! Luffy shouted, attempting to plow through the man. However, he was met by a forearm to the gut, which sent him skidding across the ground and into a heap. He stood and winced, the man had used haki. Fangor Daigen, Windsor whispered, he's a vice admiral. And a powerful fruit user. Luffy scowled and looked ahead at their opponent, who was now too busy flexing to notice the pirate's attention. Vice Admiral Daigen stood proudly in his height, as though it were the requirement for anyone in the upper ranks of the Marines. He also had an incredible mass of red hair, which sprouted from not only his head, but also his underarms and legs by the looks of things. Go on ahead, Luffy told them, I'll hold this guy off. We'll meet you later, Frankie said as he, Brook and Windsor departed the scene, bound for the fourth port. Straw Hat Luffy, the Vice Admiral boomed once the other three had scrambled out of sight, you think you have a chance of outmatching me? Quote. Who knows? Luffy said, but I need to defeat you. So I will. Daigen smirked as he glanced Luffy up and down. Those are some big words for a little guy. Vice Admiral, a nearby officer stuttered, this is Straw Hat Luffy. I don't think it would be wise to underestimate him. We've heard of what he can do. The officer suddenly had to take a drastic sidestep in order to avoid the thick arm that came swiping his was in retaliation. Yes, I have heard, Daigen snapped in response, but you shouldn't believe everything you hear. I know he's strong, but come on, look at him. Quote. Luffy blinked back in response, a finger exploring the contents of his left nostril. Again. He's puny. The Vice Admiral continued, I doubt he's capable of the things we've read about. Now if he were as well built as someone like, say Eustace Kid or myself, then I may have something more to worry about. As it is though, I won't be letting a mere child such as himself get by me. But I saw him at Marineford a few years ago, another officer argued, and he'd be stronger by now. Believe me sir, he lives up to his name. Remember what happened last time you underestimated an opponent and they ended up stealing your much prized back scratcher from right out of your back pocket. Quote. And don't forget yesterday morning, when you underestimated the heat of your breakfast and burnt your tongue. Another officer interjected. All right, you lot. Daigen snapped at last, get away from here. I don't need you around for me to defeat Straw Hat. Go after his nakama, make yourselves useful. About half the officers gave a nod and slowly jogged in the approximate direction the three others had run, before Daigen sighed and turned back to Luffy. Now, I guess I should take care of you. This won't take long. The Vice Admiral didn't charge mindlessly into battle as some opponents may have. Rather, he stood there without moving, as though anticipating for Luffy to make the first strike. So, Luffy said, cracking his knuckles to prepare them for the impending fight, are you going to do something, hairy rhino? Quote. Quite a sharp tongue you have there, Straw Hat, the Vice Admiral reprimanded, a sharp tongue, but a dull mind. Luffy only blinked at him in response. Very well, Daigen muttered, if you're not going to act, I guess I will. Tactic 54. Quote. For a moment, Luffy anticipated some sort of failed attempt at a spell, or an explosion. After all, that's what happened whenever Ichigo tried any of those weird numbered attacks of his. However, the Vice Admiral's display was quite different. With a pair of dark-gloved hands, Daigen was running at him, gaining speed and velocity with each step. It may have just been Luffy's imagination, but his hair seemed to be lengthening as well, growing wilder. Before he knew it, however, he'd been launched through the air at an immense speed. He landed heavily, impacting the soil with such force he was sent nearly a meter through it. Such an experience would have hurt had he not been made of rubber. As it was, he'd met the ground with such impact he was now somewhat lodged an entire meter down in it. On top of that, the Vice Admiral seemed to already believe he'd won. And that's that, Daigen said curtly, ridding himself of his black leather gloves and handing them to a servant like subordinate. Straw Hat Luffy defeated within mere moments by myself. He began walking away, his followers trailing behind him. Luffy stretched up a hand and grabbed hold of the turf beside his crater. With a light tug, he pulled himself up out of the ground and back onto the equal ground. Where do you think you're going? Exclamation mark. Hairy Rhino. He yelled across to the retreating Vice Admiral. Daigen drew to a stop and slowly turned his head, the shock evident in his eyes. You're not defeated? He questioned, a look of distaste etched across his features. No, Luffy coughed, getting to his feet and cracking his knuckles as he assumed a battle stance. You're going to have to try a bit harder. The room was dark, dank, and overall unappealing. Nami had a hard time believing that it belonged to the Tenryubito. But upon second thought she realized that probably only servants were sent in here. At any rate, she needed to be wary. Creeping her way across the dusty floor, she caught sight of a cabinet across the room. That must be where the keys are, she noted as she began her way over. However, only a few steps into her journey she realized she wasn't alone. A large creature sat in the middle of the room, between her and the cabinet. She squinted in the dark to try and make sense of what the thing was, but the dark made it almost shapeless. She sighed. Whatever it was, she could probably fight it, but there was no time for that. If she could avoid the fight, it would save time. And time was valuable right now. She knew her cloud would not hold forever. Mirage tempo, she breathed, sliding the Klima tact across her body. Invisibility came in very handy sometimes, and this situation was potentially one of them. Nonetheless, she needed to keep quiet. She nimbly tiptoed across the room and towards the cabinet, making sure not to disturb the creature as she went. It didn't take long to reach the cabinet. There was only one set of keys, so she grabbed them. However, they jingled as she took them, a sound that was surprisingly loud in the otherwise silent room. The creature moved suddenly, its head snapping up to attention. Whatever it was looking right at her. Or right through her. At any rate, she could see the glow of two large, round eyes in the dark. It turned its head to look around the room for the source of the noise, but rested again when it could find nothing. This time, Nami made special effort to try and discern what the figure actually was. An Excel pod? She muttered after a moment, noting the creature's body vaguely shared a resemblance to Marion the Stegosaurus. She returned her attention to the task at hand. Now wasn't the time to stand around and stare at the creature. She held the keys close and hurried out of the room. Re-entering the main interior of the port, she hurried for the two cells. "I have the keys," she said, holding it up as she ran. There was mild cheering amongst the prisoners in response. The red glow of light from the sky outside allowed her a better look at the set of keys. There were two keys all up, one for the cells and the other, she gathered, for any chains or cuffs. Fumbling slightly, she tried the first key in the lock of the closest cell, but it didn't click. The second key, however, granted the satisfying click she was waiting for, and she briefly relaxed in relief before quickly moving on to the next cell. The next few minutes consisted using the other key to unlock any further restraints the prisoners had. Finally, she reached Sanji. One of his arms had been cuffed to the wall in order to further disable him. "You saved me, Nami-san," he smiled to her as she undid his cuffs. "Is this your way of confessing your love for me?" Quote. "Yes, Sanji, of course," she complied half-heartedly as his restraints clattered to the ground. "That means she loves me too." Catherine realized. "And me?" One of the now former slaves put in, "She saved me as well." Quote. "Shut up." Sanji snapped as others of the freed slaves' congregation began expressing how Nami must love each of them in turn. "Sanji-kun," Nami's voice regained his attention. "Yes, Tilda?" He turned back to her, love struck. "You," she began, looking up into Sanji's eyes as he stared back into her own. "Yes, Nami-san?" He prompted as he reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Owe me for this," she shouted, proceeding to whack him over the head. "Ah! Sanji!" Chopper panicked. A moment later, everyone had gathered outside the port. The outside air was warm, even more so than it had been before Nami had entered Port 4. The air was also thicker, due to the cloud shield declining in strength. Not that it was hard to breathe, yet at least. It was just a consistent reminder that they needed to be off the island soon. The evacuation port isn't too far from here, Catherine assured. I think all the civilians have left, but these should still be a boat or two still there. Sanji-kun, you should go ahead in case the others need help, Nami instructed. The rest of us need to help these people evacuate. Then we'll find Zoro and Ichigo, join with the others, get back on the ship and leave. You're right. Sanji said, Robin-chan needs me. And before anything else could be said, he had thundered away in the direction of the cliffs. Let's go, Catherine said, leading the way. As they hurried along, Nami side-glanced Jared. You know, she said, is it going to be okay for you to return to Atlantica after all this? Quote. The former slave laughed. I don't think that was any of our plans. Few of us are from here originally. Well, I am, but not many of the others are. And you're just going to leave? Quote. I don't really have a choice. I have nothing keeping me here anyway. Those of us who are originally from here never did anything against the law to warrant our imprisonment, he said, nothing major at least. What mattered was that those of us originally from this island came from the Lopingian ward. Lopingian, Nami muttered, where have I heard that name recently? It's a bit of a no-go zone, Jared explained, not often included in the census. Ah, I remember. We flew over in with Marion and Pascal when we first got here, Chopper said. That would be the place, Jared said. Maybe one day I can return here, but that won't be for a long time. Not until the hierarchy is changed. But I know that day will come. Until then, I've got a couple of things I wouldn't mind doing out in the world. Zoro looked on as the Hollow continued to attack. Despite the Hollow's words, this had gone on for a while now. It had become obvious some time ago that by now the Hollow was only toying with its opponent. Metsumeri's commentating had barely subsided, however. But eventually, it became obvious that the Hollow had gotten bored of its charge. In a single moment, it launched forward almost too swiftly to track, its eyes glaring with a morbid glee as it hacked into its opponent. Blood sprayed like a sheet of rain from the now gaping wound in Metsumeri's side as the Vice Admiral cursed and strung together a couple of unintelligible sentences on the matter. By now, he was no longer declaring the moves of his next attacks. Nor was he attacking much at all. With the monster his opponent had become consistently on the offensive, neither giving him the chance nor an opening to place a single blow. And he was tearing, struggling to even maintain his defense as the Hollow ripped through it with its coarse, claw-like phalanges. The battle would not be lasting much longer. Metsumeri brandished his blade with a glint in his eyes as he evidentially prepared for something. An actual secret technique, in which he verbally revealed nothing. In a burst of sorrow, he rocketed towards the Hollow, swinging the blade and the troublesome metal wire that came with it. But the Hollow caught the wire with its left hand, entwining it around its fingers in a feat that would sever those of anyone else. It then reeled its opponent in. Metsumeri clearly had not been expecting such a thing, and began swiping his blade at the Hollow once it was within reaching distance. But the Hollow was too quick, catching the blade mid-strike with a bare hand. And it was over. The Hollow shattered the Vice Admiral's blade with a flick of the wrist. Metsumeri went sprawling across the uneven ground like a tossed sack of potatoes, completely and utterly defeated. Zoro looked on as the Hollow advanced on its opponent once again. Its hand ensnared the hilt of the borrowed katana as it flew toward its target. Zoro felt his eyes widening at the hollow's actions. Metsumeri was defeated, but his opponent wasn't satisfied. The entity contained in Ichigo's body brandished the katana, now a breath away from striking the Vice Admiral dead. Zoro knew he needed to act fast. The real Ichigo wouldn't want this. The hollow reached its overcome opponent and made the move to impale him all in the one movement. But Zoro reached it before it could fully accomplish its intentions, tightly gripping hold of the hollow's sword-wielding wrist. "Ichigo," he said quietly but firmly, "that's enough. This fight is over. This isn't you." He could feel the strength of the hollow pressuring against his own, the katana sure to plow into the body of the incapacitated Vice Admiral should Zoro withdraw his restraint. The hollow growled softly from beneath the mask. "Ichigo," he repeated, hiding the fact he was unsure he'd be able to coax the Shinigami back like this. The creature whose arm he was holding was clearly not Ichigo at all. And Zoro wasn't even sure why he was using the name of the decent young guy he'd come to know for this monster. Because Ichigo has to be in there somewhere, he reasoned. Nonetheless, it seemed to work. The hand at the end of the arm Zoro was gripping lessened its hold of the katana, until the sword dropped to the ground with a whump in the hand, as well as the rest of the body, went lax. Zoro quickly grabbed Ichigo's shoulders, steadying him before he could follow the katana to the ground. "Oi, Ichigo," he said, shaking him slightly, "keep it together." Quote. Ichigo glanced around at the barren cityscape of his inner world. There was something different about this place. Something was off. Everything seemed whitewashed, as though the color had fading. And if he looked carefully enough, he could have sworn he could see it slowly fading all the more. A shadow came across him, and he looked up to see the spirit of his Zanpakuto standing in front of him, in plain sight. Ichigo blinked, afraid that Zangetsu would disappear should he close his eyes for too long. "Zangetsu," he said, "you're here." How could we become separate, Ichigo?" His sword spoke to him, its voice like a fading breeze. "What?" Ichigo questioned, "I'm coming for you though, I won't be much longer." "It won't make any difference," Zangetsu said as he faded into translucency. "Don't go." Ichigo shouted after him, attempting to run, though his feet were fastened to the building's surface. He felt the pain he'd felt in Shangpyo, the feeling of something inside of him being pulled away. "Don't go." But another voice was invading his thoughts now, pulling him from the darkness of his and Zangetsu's world. "Ichigo. Oi, Ichigo." Quote. Ichigo opened his eyes, forgotten energy flooding back at once. He found Zoro supporting him by the shoulders, the only thing preventing him from slumping to the ground. "Keep it together," the swordsman continued reprimanding him. "Zoro," Ichigo said, steadying himself before the swordsman released hold of his shoulders. His arm was badly aching and stinging. He winced as he revolved it around its socket a few times, before realizing that it was actually there. It was actually attached. His now brown eyes narrowed and trailed their gaze over to the defeated Metsumeri. "Did I?" "It was that hollow," Zoro answered gruffly. Ichigo looked at him for a moment, before looking away and continuing to shrug his mended arm. "Sorry," he muttered, "I wasn't expecting for him to come out." "Forget that for now," Zoro said, taking note of the way the volcano was brewing in the distance. His eyes flicked back to the substitute Shinigami when he stumbled slightly. "You're still hurt." "I'll be fine. Have you heard from the others yet?" Quote, "Oi! Zoro! Ichigo!" Chopper's voice carried over to them as he appeared on the hillside with Nami, Catherine and about a dozen former slaves. "Catherine," Dan called as he sent the last of the Marines running, "you managed to get free then." "No thanks to you," she responded as El Santino chirruped and ambled over to her. "We've gotta get out of here now, you know. Our cover has well and truly been blown." "Ah, that's a shame," Dan said. "It was a good few years here, at least." "How are the others doing?" Zoro asked. "I'm not too sure," Nami said. "Robin was taken by the Tenryubito, but Luffy and the others went to free her." Zoro frowned. "How many Marines are still here?" Quote, "We didn't see any on our way, aside from just now," Nami answered. "But I'd imagine there's be some around where the others are." "Alright," said Zoro, "I'll go over there then." He began running in a random direction. "That's not a good idea," Chopper shouted after him. "I'll go with him," Dan said. "He won't get lost with me." He called after the swordsman, "Oi! It's this way." Quote, "Stick with them, Ichigo," Zoro said as he came back past. Before addressing the other crew members, "Meet up back here in an hour, when the ship comes in." "Alright," they nodded. Ichigo went with the others as they headed to the coast to evacuate the former slaves. "There's one ship left," Nami said as they approached the shore. "We'll get out of here for sure now," one of the men said cheerfully. However, a line of Marines stood in their way, all now wearing protective smoke masks to combat the steadily growing density of volcanic smog. By the looks of things, these were some of the only officers left on the island. The collective group of Ichigo, pirates, former slaves and land-dwelling plesiosaurs slowed to a halt. "Let us through," Catherine requested, coming to the front of the group. "Why should we?" an officer questioned. "You're wanted criminals. We've been told to capture you, not let you go." "This lot aren't wanted criminals," Catherine said, indicating to the former slaves. "They're civilians and they should be evacuated." "They're not civilians," a higher-ranking officer who appeared to be a commodore said as he stepped forward. "They're just a bunch of slaves. And slaves aren't allowed off this island. But we've gotten them this far." Nami argued, "What harm will it do if you just let them hop on this boat?" Quote, "None, probably," the Commodore admitted, "but they're slaves." Before Nami could snap a reply, another officer joined the argument. "Let them on," the voice demanded from within the crowd of Marines. Ichigo looked over to see a young boy with sandy hair and braces addressing the surrounding officers. Unlike many of the officers around him, he was not wearing one of the protective masks. "Oi, Charlie," a likewise unmasked purple-haired boy, who must have been his friend, hissed from beside him, "What are you doing?" Quote, "I'm standing by what Smoker-san said," Charlie responded. "Our job as Marines is to protect people. And these people need our protection just as much as anyone else." So these two are some of Smoker's guys, Ichigo realized. "They're G5, a nearby officer observed. "Former G5, another officer corrected. "Does it matter? At any rate, don't listen to them, and don't let the slaves off the island." The officers grunted their compliance and prepared to use physical force if need be, to keep the slaves from entering the evacuation vessel. However, the purple-haired boy stood in their way. "We're not going to let you harm these people," he insisted, before looking to Chopper. "Get them to safety, Tanuki." Well, conspiring with a pirate," the Commodore observed. "A pirate with a better sense of justice than you, a giddy," Charlie said. The Commodore lunged at him, but Charlie was too quick. He nimbly slid under the officer's enraged, flailing arms and appeared behind him. "I'm not going to listen to you," he said. "Smoker-san said our duty was to the people." "Smoker isn't your leader anymore," the man said. "I am." And quicker than Charlie could react, Agiti had turned and withdrawn a sturdy cane from within his coat. He harshly jabbed into Charlie's gut, winding him. "Charlie!" Merlin shouted in panic as the Commodore cruelly twisted the cane further into Charlie's stomach. Charlie gasped for breath. "This will teach you a lesson," the Commodore uttered, wrenching the cane back with a painful twist. Ichigo watched as Charlie doubled over. Although the cane was no longer being forcefully probed into his gut, he seemed to have trouble breathing. Between the odd gasp for air, a set of nasty coughs would rack his frame, until a mix of blood and vomit was regurgitated and Charlie collapsed to the ground, his breath heaving in exhaustion. What the hell was he hit with? Exclamation mark. Ichigo wondered as Charlie shivered on the ground. His thoughts were disrupted by an explosion. He looked up, only to see a smoldering crater in the only remaining evacuation ship. It then burst into flames. Nami cursed. "Not the ship." Chopper cried. "No," Charlie rasped, before retching once again and falling into another coughing lapse. "Not immune to sea stone, hey?" Agiti noted with a sneer, "Then come on boys. Let's teach this new recruit a lesson." The surrounding Marines responded by jeering and proceeded to kick it and beat the crippled officer. Charlie. Merlin had been pushed back and had no way of reaching his friend. "They're going to kill that boy," Catherine said, fists clenching. "Leave him alone." Chopper shouted, suddenly increasing in size and running toward the commotion, shoving officers aside. Ichigo couldn't simply watch anymore. In a solid movement he leapt into the scuffle and brandished the borrowed katana, forcing any of the offending officers away and standing protectively over the young Marine. "How can you justify what you're doing?" He berated them. "You think you're the good guys just because you're in line with the law? What a load of bullshit." Quote, "Step aside, boy," Agiti commanded him. "And you're the worst of them," Ichigo said, pointing his katana at the Commodore. "You know, if I were asked a couple of weeks back, I would have said that the pirates were the bad guys and the Navy were the good guys. But now I'm really not sure. I mean, I know that there are Marines who are good people." He briefly glanced at the boy he was protecting, before returning his focus to Agiti, "But they're certainly not you." Quote, "A pirate saved me." Charlie rasped from behind him in a small voice, "Gya." Before he could continue his panic, he erupted into another fit of coughs. Ichigo glanced back at the young Marine, before stooping down and hefting him upright. "Don't let them get away," Agiti ordered, but Ichigo had already flash-stepped into the air. "For one thing, I'm not actually a pirate," Ichigo said to Charlie, "and for another thing, if you don't want to choke on vomit, then shut up." Charlie made a sound of grudging agreement. It wasn't like he was in the position to refuse, and even leant into Ichigo slightly as the substitute Shinigami took them through the air. "You let them escape," Agiti shouted at the nearest officers as Ichigo touched down a number of meters away from them. Merlin scurried out of the group of Marines and closer to his friend. "Get them," Agiti ordered, but his commands were short-lived. Smoker and some of the G5 officers had arrived. Even from behind his shades, Ichigo could tell the 4 places Smoker had looked. From the group of former slaves, to the burning evacuation ship, to Agiti and the group of Marines, to the beat-up Charlie and distressed-looking Merlin. "What's going on here?" he asked, glaring at the Commodore. "They hurt Charlie," Merlin moped quietly. Smoker glanced over to where Ichigo was supporting Charlie and extended his arms. Ichigo passed the young Marine across to him whilst Tashigi tended to Merlin. "Am I going to be demoted for this, Smoker-san?" Charlie coughed weakly. "Not if I can help it," Smoker replied, before glancing up and addressing Agiti. "I'll give you 30 seconds to get out of here, Commodore." "We should kill him, sir," one of the G5 officers prompted, "or maim him at least." "Do you wish to be like him?" Smoker asked, and the officer shut up, before turning to Agiti once again. "You harmed one of my men," he said. "You're lucky I'm letting you off like this." "You're forgetting that those 2 officers now belong to me," the Commodore snapped. "They don't belong to anyone but themselves. Now scram before I make this become serious." Agiti stared at him for a long moment, blatant fury present on his face. For a moment, Ichigo wondered if he would refuse. But it seemed that despite his evident distaste, Agiti wasn't willing to oppose Smoker any more than he already had. "Retreat to the ships," he ordered the surrounding Marines, and within half a minute they departed. "What can we do now?" Nami asked once they'd left. If only they'd spared that ship, this wouldn't be a problem. Did someone say problem? Quote, "The gathered pirates, marines, ex-slaves and otherwise whirled around to see a man proudly sitting atop a hovering Excelpod. Pascal. Marion." Chopper cried out as the tour guide and the flying Stegosaurus touched down beside them. El Santino chirruped excitedly at the sight of the other dinosaur. "I would have thought you'd evacuated by now," Nami said, as he jumped to the ground. "The truth is, I've been planning to move away from this place for some time," Pascal explained. "Marion has plenty of room, if anyone fancies a lift." "We have a bit of room on our ship as well," Catherine said helpfully. "Marion can paddle alongside El Santino if she likes." They seem to be getting along. "But how long will we be able to travel like that?" the fishman asked. "As long as it takes," Catherine replied. "If you stick with me and the Dino Cafe people, you should be very well looked after when we reach our destination." "Out of curiosity, where are you planning to go?" Pascal asked. "Somewhere that accepts all types and former classes of people," Catherine responded simply. "What a coincidence," Pascal said with a smile. "That sounds a lot like where I'm headed." As the pair and others continued to discuss their plans for the next few months, Smoker cleared his throat to get Ichigo's attention. "Tell Straw Hat I said hi," he instructed, before he and his fleet turned to leave, "and make sure he gets off this island. I expect circumstances to be different next time." No problem," Ichigo said. The path was completely protected from the ever-building volcanic fumes. Not that it mattered for someone who was soon to be executed. The wind was warm and uncomfortable, not that that mattered either. Robin glanced at the jagged cliffs and churning water below. If someone were to fall, the impact of the water on their bodies would surely cause their ribcages to be crushed through their lungs and their hearts to explode. That was, of course, if their body managed to not make contact with the rocks and decorate them with a predominantly red modern-style artwork. The obnoxiously dressed man in front of her cleared his throat and scanned his gaze across the ritual's attendees, his eyes landing on her last. "Let's begin," he said. Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. My apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See you next time, faves.